Former US Secretary of State Hilary Clinton has appeared on MSNBC to promote a plan for Ukraine, turning it into Afghanistan. This is what she said.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on, because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. We have to watch this carefully. We have to provide sufficient military armaments for the Ukraine military and volunteers.
So Clinton there is not only citing Afghanistan as a possible model for Ukraine, but seems to be endorsing it. The conflict she's referring to there is the Soviet-Afghan War that lasted from 1979 to 1989. The war followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which aimed to shore up a puppet government. And the Soviets then met with an intense and sustained resistance, which was heavily backed by the USSR's geopolitical foes, the United States. We should ask, though, who specifically were the US funding here? Well, the fighters leading the anti-Soviet struggle were a group of warlords and Islamists known as the Mujahideen. President Reagan can be seen here speaking in 1987 at a meeting with one of their commanders.
Any proposal unacceptable to the resistance is destined to fail. And as the resistance continues the fight, we and other responsible governments will stand by it. The support that the United States has been providing the resistance will be strengthened rather than diminished, so that it can continue to fight effectively for freedom. The just struggle against foreign tyranny can count upon worldwide support, both political and material. The goal of the United States remains a genuinely independent Afghanistan, free from external interference, an Afghanistan whose people choose the type of government they wish, an Afghanistan to which the 4 million refugees from Soviet aggression may return in safety and, yes, in honor. On behalf of the American people, I salute Chairman Khalis, his delegation, and the people of Afghanistan themselves. You are a nation of heroes. God bless you.
Mujahideen fighters were trained and armed by the United States, and they were successful in defeating the Soviet occupation. But contrary to Reagan's promise there, that didn't mean the Afghan public got to choose who ruled them. Instead of Afghanistan becoming a flourishing democracy, the Soviet withdrawal was followed by a bloody civil war between Mujahideen factions, and it would only end when in 1996 the Taliban took control. You probably know what followed from that point onwards. The Taliban would harbour Osama bin Laden, a former Mujahideen fighter who then organised 9/11. In response, Afghanistan was invaded by NATO, which, remember, we're told is a purely defensive alliance, and Afghanistan would spend 20 years occupied by the West. The US would then withdraw, the Taliban would retake power, and now the Afghan people face starvation due to sanctions from the United States. A recent ITV report showed the consequence of those sanctions.
To the people here, all these children, it doesn't matter that the Americans have gone and that the Taliban have come back. What does matter is that they just don't have enough to eat, and that it feels like they are being forced slowly but inevitably towards starvation.
They work miracles at the children's hospital. They need to for babies like Hazibullah, whose survival seems against all odds. Amina fights for breath, her malnourished body unable to fight off infection. Her mother tells her she will stay at her bedside until God decides her daughter's fate. For week after week, staff worked without pay. They still lacked medicine and equipment, and sometimes even miracles won't do.
We have in the previous months, mortality was about 200.
200 children.
200 children was died in here.
But underlying it always is
Yes,
hunger. It's just hunger.
You might ask, why am I saying all of this now? What does Afghanistan have to do with Ukraine? Can we assume that arming the Ukrainian resistance will lead to the same consequences as did arming the Mujahideen? Well, of course, so much of this is uncertain. Different policies will mean different things in different places. I wouldn't suggest otherwise. But one question we should keep in mind: why does Hillary Clinton still consider the Afghanistan example something worth repeating? Is it because it proved to be in the best interests of Afghan people? That would be difficult to argue. 500,000 to 2 million civilians died in the Soviet-Afghan war, not to mention what happened after. So might there be another reason she considers it a success? Well, one thing that arming the Afghan rebellion did certainly achieve was damaging America's geopolitical foe, the Soviet Union. Any narrative which considers America's involvement in the Soviet-Afghan war a success is one concerned not with the lives of Afghans, but with the geopolitical interests of the United States of America. I have to say, when it comes to Ukraine, I'm in no way reassured the same thing won't happen again.
This kind of catch-22 situation, which we repeatedly seem to find ourselves in. We found ourselves in it in Afghanistan, and we seem to be finding ourselves in it now. This is reflective of the deep systemic issues with how our world is organized. When you organize the world into a series of essentially imperialist blocs who are competing for economic hegemony, political hegemony, and then you flood that world with weapons, with for-profit arms trade, and a sort of clash of civilizations narrative, and you gut international diplomatic institutions of their legitimacy and power, then countries that happen to either be geopolitically in a strategic location like Ukraine, or that happen to, like Afghanistan, be sitting on lucrative reserves, these countries then become pawns in those broader imperial struggles. And these countries where, the ordinary population end up having to live under the endless anxiety and risk of war, of intervention, of invasion, and attacks on their democratic system. Because this crisis in Ukraine didn't just start with this most recent aggression. The Ukrainians have been living in this kind of limbo state of anxiety for many, many years now. And it's the regular people that routinely suffer from a world that is organized in that way, as we've seen over the past few weeks in the kind of increased scrutiny of the flowing of Russian elite money throughout London. We know that it's not the financial elite of those competing factions that really suffer. The financial elites of Russia, Britain, and the US have been collaborating pretty frictionlessly in order to enhance their own investment portfolios. And then when it comes to these moments of rupture, of violence, it's not, again, those elites that suffer the most. And, despite that clash of civilizations narrative that is really underpinning so much of this, and that we hear, as you mentioned, the narratives through which war is described, it's actually, if you're looking at it through a lens of those elites, their interests are actually more often than not more aligned than you think. But it's within that lens of the world being organized in imperial blocks that the capturing of Afghanistan can be seen as a success story, because it's not about, are the Afghanis living a decent and dignified life? That was never actually the question. It's, has this strategically important site been kept on our side rather than theirs? Is our empire winning or is theirs? And that doesn't just happen militaristically, it happens financially, it happens politically. We have been seeing We know the impacts of the British and the US empires, but we've also been seeing this ramping up of the embedding of, Russian financial empire and Chinese financial empire, particularly in the continent of Africa. And so within that framework, the actual needs and democratic wishes of occupied nations, whether they're formally occupied or informally occupied, or in the crosshairs for whatever reason of both of these imperial blocs, they always end up in this impossible situation of being backed into that corner because their democratic wishes are not legible within that system. Those wishes can only either be exploited cynically or actively repressed. And then you end up in this catch-22 situation when it all culminates and we look at it and we think, well, what is the choice here? And it's the elimination of that choice that creates crisis. We all remember those images of the Taliban taking over and Afghans holding onto the wings of US fighter jets when it seemed like the only options were Taliban rule or further US invasion. That kind of colonial exit strategy of destabilize and abandon, of treating countries like pawns on a chessboard, that is a long old, colonial strategy. Sorry. We saw it in the partition in India. We saw it in Afghanistan, and I'm worried that we are going to see it here as well.